Hello and welcome. I am Maria, also known as Brown Girl Interrupting, and this is Pain to Power, where we talk about the connection between our healing journey and finding our power and leading with love. And in particular, I wanted to kind of go back a little bit today in thinking about the purpose of this show, which is it is storytelling and the power of storytelling to heal. And the connection is there's actually some neuroscience behind this. And I got to give a shout out to my colleague, Joan Mori, who's taught me so much about this idea of the neuroscience. But when we tell stories, we actually release something called oxytocin, which is a chemical that is the happy chemical. It makes us happy, but there's a power to it. So when we are sharing our stories and learning about each other and learning about things that we would otherwise not known, we are actually connecting, building empathy, and building community. So as you join me today in Pain to Power, and I introduce my very exciting guest who is himself a storyteller and using history and the storytelling of that to heal. He is a historian, a curator, and the founder of History Heals Consulting LLC. Welcome, Marcus Sankofa Nix.
Thank you. Thank you. Excited to have this conversation, and thank you so much for having me on this platform. So appreciate being here.
Thank you so much. I am so glad that you were able to join us today. How are you doing today?
I am doing well. I'm excited. Been looking forward to us talking. I'm glad we connected recently at a conference and talked and dialogued. And I think today is special, and so I'm excited. And I'm starting my day off with this. So it's a good thing to start off with something like this.
I love it. It's a beautiful day to start off like this. And yes, and I'm so glad that you brought up how we met, because honestly, this is why I've asked you to come, because I met Marcus at the Bond Academy, which is another transformative experience that I went through, where I was able to go into a session where I walked in and I knew right away that this is someone who is truly taking pain and turning it into power through history. And so you've been doing that through your consulting, but I want to kind of take us back a little bit before we go into where you are now, because now you are obviously taking history and healing through it. But I would love to know more about just kind of your journey in this idea of pain to power. Starting with you are Marcus Sankofa Nix, but Sankofa has a lot of significance to everything that you do. Can you speak to a little bit more of what Sankofa means and what it means for you?
Sure. Great way to start off our conversation. So Sankofa is a significant, meaningful aspect of who I am. It's a name that I inherited or was granted by an elder of mine, one who I met in college, and as I was, a college student in the hills of Campbellsville, Kentucky, learning a lot about African history and culture and whatnot. There was a gentleman who I connected with named Elder Furlow, and didn't really have a lot of connection on campus. I played basketball and whatnot. And so getting all this information, he invited me to lecture with him, and I lectured with him. And afterwards, after I shared what I had to say, and I think the lecture that I connected with him on and presented with had something to do with history, African history and African culture. But afterwards, he said it was a Sankofa experience. I'll never forget that. And so that kind of led me to continue on in that vein with the mission of my life. The term Sankofa means, as we look to the future, let us reclaim our past. Let us never forget our history. As we move forward, we look back. And so that is indicative of my life journey, my mission. And so the term is an African term of the Akan language, spoken throughout Africa, primarily West Africa. And so that's a term that I don't take lightly, and it's very much indicative of my life story. And so it's a significant part of me. So, yeah.
I love that. That is beautiful. And thank you for sharing. And to have that, I always appreciate how we sometimes come to who we are later in life. right? And that discovery itself. So it sounds like Elder Furlow was able to take you to that path of where, to continue that, and that's beautiful. So in this, though, and in Sankofa, it really is a lot of the journey of pain to power. How would you describe that, this idea of taking pain and turning it into power?
Yes, another good question. I would say for me, um, being a child, I came from a positive home, a positive upbringing. My mother and father, the only child, so no siblings, no brothers or sisters. It was always be myself and I. Came up in a good home, very fortunate and blessed. However, when it came to what I was learning in the school system, especially K through 12, um, there wasn't that much that I was taught that had to do with African history or African American history or Black history. And so it's not till I would say I really got to college and started to learn about certain Black intellectuals and Black thinkers and Black theories, taking courses like world religion, world history, and then, doing research and seeing how so much connected to Africa. I realized just how much I was not taught when I was younger. And that bothered me. There was some anger that was there. There was some frustration that was there. Um, uh, Even though my parents did a great job and I grew up in Howard County, positions itself and has a reputation of being one of the top school systems in all of the country, top library systems in all of the country. There weren't that many educators who looked like me in my growing up years, going through the K through 12 system. And I don't recall having a whole lot of experiences really intentionally learning about African-American history and culture. And so once I got older, like I said, and I went to college, I had an uncle named Harold Bennett. He's an ancestor. Rest in peace. He hit me off with some books like Nile Valley Contribution to Civilization. I remember he put me on to the autobiography of Malcolm X. So I remember like being in college, and I remember being on the basketball team and going to class, being a student athlete. And he used to put me on to different books and different things to read. And for a long time, I kind of just disregarded it and pushed it to the side. But I remember when I was at one point, I said, you know what? My uncle's always hit me off with different things to check out. Maybe I should, crack open the book and kind of read and see what it's like. And once I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, Nile Valley Contribution to Civilization, and the likes of other works, I was hooked because it just opened up the door to so many things that I was not taught. And so what I realized is just the history as I was unlearning and relearning. Part of that process was just to see the long historical memory connected to history being deprived, African Americans not being able to read and write. Even today, when we see banned books and we hear about critical race theory and we hear about AP African American studies being banned, these things are not new. Perhaps it's new in the sense of these are present day issues and topics, but the historical memory suggests if we look in the past, from anti-literacy laws to consequences and punishments for those African Americans trying to grapple with literacy, reading pamphlets and reading, readers and spellers. There were some consequences. So if we look in the past, we can see the connections to the present. But nevertheless, I had to unlearn some things. And I think I questioned, well, why was this kept from me? Why am I having to now be a college student to learn these things? And it had a lot to do with how I saw myself and how I showed up in spaces and the confidence and the self-esteem and all those types of things. So it was really those counter narratives. It was those counter narratives, those counter stories that help facilitate my process. And now with the work that I do, I like to also share that with the community at large that I connect with.
I love that. And it sounds like your journey has really been connected to the idea of history, the lack and the misinformation and missing information of history being that pain point in schooling, moving you to the power of understanding it better, which I appreciate. And I really, I love that you said that this history is not new. Oftentimes, that's a missing piece in some of these conversations, particularly, and you and I are both educators, and many of the people that are going to be watching today or watching with us are educators themselves. And there's a huge importance in recognizing and understanding some of those elements, going back to Sankofa, because we have to recognize the history to understand and know how to, move forward, to look back, to move forward. Right. And so, I appreciate that. And I think you also elevated those impacts, right? Are there other things like, as you were going through school, how did that impact your own experience of just a sense of belonging in your school, in your community?
Well, I would say that growing up, the foundation that my parents established, a support system. I was fortunate to have support, and those looked out for me when I was, in school. And I was the type of person that went to a lot of different schools. I bounced around, So I grew up in Howard County. But I went to different schools within Howard County, and then also being that I played basketball. Even once I got to high school, I bounced around. So from a social standpoint, moving around, sometimes it's hard to develop those deeper relationships because you're moving around.
Mm-hmm.
But also, in terms of just having that knowledge of who I was and the history connected to those who look like me, I would say that it was a thing where if I would, I think that I probably would even be more confident at certain points in times. Perhaps hearing about some of those stories of a Harriet Tubman or a Frederick Douglass a little bit earlier. And I do remember a time where I was at a summer camp and we went to a museum, and it's interesting how it comes back full circle. As I sit in a museum here, Howard County Center of African American Culture, where I serve as a curator. I remember we went to a museum at a summer camp that I was at. I might have been maybe late elementary, early middle school age. And I remember we saw a movie and a film on Frederick Douglass. And I see Frederick Douglass, and we have a clay bust over my shoulder here. One of the artifacts that's most dear to me here. Frederick Douglass from Talbot County, a native Marylander, born enslaved, but he rises above that and becomes an abolitionist, orator, speaker, writer, and all those things. But we watch a film on his life, and during the time of enslavement, he is one who doesn't just bow his head and passively go along with the institution of slavery. He has pride in who he is, and he just isn't a docile type of enslaved person. So they send him to a person named Edward Covey, and Covey is supposed to be the slave breaker, so the person who's supposed to get all the unruly enslaved beings in check. Well, Douglass has something for Covey. So when Covey tries to rough up Frederick Douglass, he says, "Oh no, it's not going down like that." And he literally fights Edward Covey, and he is victorious over Edward Covey. And from that point on, Edward Covey never really messes with him and gets at him in the same way that he did before. And so when I saw that as a young child, I remember that experience vividly, as I'm telling you now. And I remember, wow, like it was such a different perspective that I had been met with before. Because even when I did get the history, even though it was few and far between, it would usually be African Americans being depicted from a more victimized standpoint, more of a deficit-based approach. And I didn't have the understanding or the language that I'm using now then, but now I can go back and say, yeah, like when I was first introduced to African American concepts, it was oftentimes slavery, brutality, violence, and all of that. But when I saw what happened with Frederick Douglass and Edward Covey, it reframed in that story, in that incident, how he fought back. There was resistance there. There was agency there. There was, and even Douglass is a great case study to talk about pain to power, because he actually, picked up, a writing tool and began writing and began telling his own story in his slave narrative or his freedom narrative to provide a way to resist and push back against those narratives that would suggest that he was a happy-go-lucky slave. So stories matter, as you said, in terms of the oxytocin releasing and those ramifications. But stories can imprison, they can incarcerate the mind, they can stereotype, they can box us in, they can stagnate our growth, they can make us look at ourselves in inferior ways. They can be traumatizing. But on the flip side, stories can also empower. Stories can also uplift. Stories can also inform us on how to navigate and how to move forward. And so at that point, I remember going to my teacher after we saw that film on Douglass, and I said, wow, like I never saw African Americans too much in that light. I'm used to seeing the Feed the Children commercials and, them in Africa and them being malnourished and unfed, and flies and insects are crawling all over their body. And the teacher looked at me and said, well, what happened with Frederick Douglass? He stood up for what he believed in. So it's up to you to continue to move that forward and not let that happen again. And so this was, like I said, I was young, but even as I'm telling you the story, reliving the experience in my mind, that stuck with me. And so just like many I've taught in the school system, there have been students who, when I taught African American Studies seminar in the Howard County Public School System, they were hesitant. They were kind of unsure if they wanted to take my class because they thought African American Studies seminar, once again, was going to take them back. And their point of reference was going to be brutality, violence, suffering, pain. And what I oftentimes say with the work I do as a consultant, telling stories as a curator, a storyteller, professional developments and all, the African American experience, or the experience through the lens of African Americans, is more than just suffering. It's more than just trauma. It's more than just pain. It's more than just that. That's a part of the story, but it's not the totality of the story. So in the work that I do, once again, just like Douglass and, other instances, countless stories that we can tease, that we can tease out lessons from. There's strength there's strength and power in approaching history, instilling humanity and courage and bravery and resilience and perseverance, as opposed to those deficit-based victimized approaches. And so that's really what keeps me continuing to do this work, seeing how it can inspire not just African Americans or Africans, but all people. So history is, I think, a tool that can heal everyone, not just Black folk.
And I love that. Thank you. And I mean, you hit so many important pieces about why you do what you do, but I think the power in what you're doing. And in particular, right, you elevated it with the interrupter of Frederick Douglass, and how you continued that interruption. And I think the way that you painted that picture of your teacher, one, to create the experience for you to see that counter narrative of Frederick Douglass as an interrupter and the power, and not the pain, and not the and not the way that oftentimes, like you said, right, the narrative of slavery, the narrative of African Americans in this country has been from that negative, lack of power and control perspective. And so everything you just said is the counter to that. And I think you hit also, which is really important, is the complexity of the way that history has been told and how it hits others. So that opportunity with that one teacher speaks so much to how, when we tell the stories from those counter perspectives, when we recognize that history can heal and not just cause pain, we change the narrative of those hearing it because it made an impact on you, right? And so, I mean, so I'm wondering with that, because you mentioned your African American Studies courses with your students and the seminars. How have you been able to really engage and move past that barrier of and very clearly a reasonable barrier in terms of that reaction of feeling like, I don't want to hear about the history of enslavement because all it is telling me the pain, right? And you are obviously changing that for students in the spaces that you've created. What's that experience like for those students, and how do you do that?
Sure. Well, I believe that teaching a discipline of African American studies or African American history, I think that it should be approached from a trauma-informed perspective. African American history is a very delicate, very tender subject matter. We see it play out before our very eyes, the tension and how politicized and how hostile it is being, and how all over the country there's different things being denied and banned in terms of engaging with history. So it's so people oftentimes come into African American studies with these preconceived notions, and oftentimes in the students as well, they are oftentimes they're from a deficit-based standpoint. We're going to start off with slavery. We're going to start off with violence. We're going to start off with lynching. We're going to start off with whipping. And I'm not generalizing. This isn't everybody, nor was this all the students. Some students were excited and ready to get it popping. But what I try to do is do things like settling the body settling exercises, or having honest and open conversations before we get into some of the content and subject matter, or talking about current events and taking the current event and the contemporary issues that are happening, and then connect that to history, taking something that they're familiar with that's going on in their world and their reality, and connecting that to something that is applicable and relevant in the past. Because whatever happens in the present, there's always a historical connection and a historical tie. And so, a lot of those students trusted me to guide them and to hold their hand and to take them on that journey. And so I also had to be flexible as well, too. And that's one of the things that a lot of educators have a hard time doing in the first place.
Oh, yes.
Flexible. I think that the COVID-19 pandemic really taught a lot of educators to be flexible. I remember there was an instance where there was a student who got bodily harmed in the school. And African American Studies seminar was like third period. So nowadays, if something happens around the school, students are on their phones, they're on Instagram, they're on TikTok, they're texting. So a student has got
social media before the principal even knows. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes, right.
So word is spread everywhere in the school that a student has been harmed. I had students who I taught in my class who knew this student. They were close to the student. The mobile crisis team was in the school. Students were breaking down, crying. Some students, didn't want to go to classes. Some students left. Students were not in an emotional place to do certain things and to engage with certain topics and things. And guess what? What we were going to talk about that day, it just so happened to fall on the day we were going to talk about lynching. It just so happened that we were going to talk about that day, domestic terrorism and racial violence. So feeling out and kind of discerning the energy and the vibe where my students were, I had to be flexible. I had to say, you know what, we'll get to that, but let me pause on that and check in with them and have a conversation and see how they're doing. So the other thing that's important as well, too, and I've said this in some of my recent posts online and whatnot, humanizing history and bringing emotions into the equation is a revolutionary act.
Yeah.
For so long, And I believe history will take care of itself once we deal with our emotions. Once we deal with our emotions, our anxiety, our guilt, our pain, our hurt, and it's not to say to ignore them or get rid of them. I'm saying once we can manage them and work through them. That's why we see, I believe, all across the country, there being such red tape around engaging with certain hot button topics and issues, because I believe a lot of people have not gotten comfortable to be able to address and deal with certain things. And there's a book where my attention is going to right now, called My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. And long story short, in that book, there's this notion of clean pain and dirty pain. So when it comes to approaching history, and I would say even many other things, the dirty pain would suggest we know we need to address or confront something. And confront is not a bad word, but when we know we need to deal with something, but we avoid, we don't want, we disregard, or we ignore it, or we try to compartmentalize it, right? We try to block it out. But that only worsens and perpetuates the issue. But when we talk about clean pain, that's on the flip side, how we can muster up enough courage and to address and confront, to acknowledge, to deal with that which is in front of us. And even the research supports that those have the propensity to address stuff and not avoid and not run, then they experience a healthier state oftentimes. But one of the ways in which we try to sometimes cope and deal with things is to run, because we think we're protecting ourselves to run and hide. But we can run from history, but we can't hide. We can't hide from history, because history, like James Baldwin said, is always with us. We carry our history with us. History is in our DNA, intergenerationally. History is in our joints, our ligaments. History is stored in our muscles. And that's why even certain groups, Black and brown groups, and the COVID-19 pandemic brought this to the forefront even more. Certain groups are more susceptible to pre-existing conditions, health outcomes and health indicators and racism, all from history. So history, it's uncomfortable to sometimes talk about these things, people being sold and people being raped and lynched and people being murdered and killed and all of that. However, what I try to do is, when we get into stuff, check in with my students, do meditation, do body settling techniques and do deep breathing and, talk about current issues and things like that, and provide those counter narratives of strength and whatnot. And just be honest with them and say, hey, we're going to talk about different things, and these things are going to provide different emotions and stuff. So having them also be in tune with themselves, and so bringing in the emotions and the feelings to what we do has really, really been important. And they also like when I'm honest with them. Students like authenticity. They like whenever you can be open and transparent with them. And once again, with the work that I've done with a lot of educators, that's not always an easy thing to do, because we oftentimes as educators like to maintain our position of authority, control. And so if I let my hair down and if I'm vulnerable and share, well, I'm still working through my discomfort with this stuff at my own self, how will they look at me? How will I be perceived? So it's a complicated phenomenon. And I would like to think that I learned from my students just as much as I would hope that they would learn from me.
Well, and you lifted so many different complexities within it, but I think also the importance of it, because particularly framing this in the fact that it's trauma-informed care. It's recognizing that part of that avoidance is the trauma that's been caused by it, but also not avoiding it, because that's actually perpetuating that trauma. But also, I think a lot of the things that you said, right? You settling in the body, having these honest and open conversations to create that condition for the safety of more complex and deeper, harder conversations about things like lynching and the extreme, the extreme things that came from enslavement, from the Jim Crow laws, from all of the history of being Black and African American in America, which continues to today, right? But I think that what you lifted is that educators need to lean into it rather than shy away from it, because of the power that it creates when you lean into it in a way with care, and recognizing that it's actually going to help with the healing for our students if we address it and recognize that how we've been doing it has been actually perpetuating the trauma. Absolutely. I think that's really important too. And I love, the way that you reference clean pain and dirty pain, because that is that way that we as individuals protect ourselves from pain oftentimes, is to avoid that pain. So as this has all come together, and I know a lot of this conversation has been very much in education, but that's not the only place that you do this work. History Heals Consulting actually works in a variety of places. And actually, I thought it was really interesting because I was looking at your website, because what I've never seen before is an education group that goes and does events and occasions. And particularly, you said that you go and speak at weddings and different occasions. Tell me a little bit about how this work leads into speaking at these very events that you wouldn't otherwise have thought a History Heals Consulting is going to be showing up and doing. So I'd love to hear more about how you do that and what took you there.
Sure. Well, thank you for asking. Really, what took me there was just trying to offer all the different things to the community that I felt as though all the different ways in which I could serve the community, whether it be wellness groups, speaking engagements, like you just mentioned, educational consulting, school districts or museums, even professional development trainings, workshops, you name it. And history is one of those things where it affects us all. We might not think about that, but, I say all the time, history, we have like where we grew up, or perhaps our family name, or the laws put in place before we got here, the societal structuring, the decisions that our parents made when we got here. Like, history affects us all. And so with that, I try to present my business as a way where whoever you are in one way or another, you can be supported through the lens of history in an empowering way. I mean, and engagements come in all different ways. I remember one day being here at the museum, and I was working on the exhibit and whatnot, and there was a wonderful couple who was looking to have a wedding at the venue right next door to us. And the place where we are located, the museum, is on top of a historic plantation in Howard County. And so they were going to get married in the venue, but what they wanted to do in their ceremony was acknowledge the enslaved, the enslaved individuals and families who were on that land. They wanted to recognize and acknowledge them. And they asked if I could come and give a short speech and give words to recognize them and honor them, those who were here prior to us. So that was a wedding. And, in that speech, I provided tidbits and nuggets of history as well, and gave some tidbits and nuggets on how we can use history to apply and inform our work moving forward. There's times where I may give talks depending on different topics. I know Juneteenth is coming up, and I've been sought after to speak about how we can imagine and envision Juneteenth and what that means, from MLK Day to all different types of, Black History Month, you name it. So really speaking, lectures, talks, I have to give a credit to my father, who's a minister. He's a Baptist preacher. On my father's side, there's a long lineage of speakers, preachers, ministers. And so once again, honing into my history, and I'm talking about bringing it to a personal level, doing my own history and my own research, trying to do a little bit of genealogy even. I was able to even tap into some of my own. I was able to tap into kind of what runs in my own family. And as I was able to see, oh, well, this is where I come from. These are the people that have gone before me in my bloodline. This is what they did and who they were. And also empowered me as well, too, to get out there and to, take a chance and to share with the community what I offer. But I have to say this, too. It's been an evolution, and there's been a number of individuals who have come in my path who have helped to add on to who I have become. A good gentleman named Dennis Alsar Winkler, the founder of TNAT Holistic Wellness Center in Baltimore. A shout out to him. He's been instrumental in my growth and development. A gentleman named Raymond Shorter, who, on the campus of Bowie State University, where I attended undergrad. Shout out to our HBCUs. He was also instrumental as well, being a JEGNA mentor of mine as well. So what I'm giving the community with History Heals is really the culmination of the experiences and those who have come along my journey in terms of leading up to that path. And what really led me to give birth to History Heals Consulting is really seeing what has happened in the past few years in terms of the landscape of education, seeing how so many educators, especially Black and Brown educators, being on the margins in terms of their needs not being met, microaggressions, burnout, taxation, some call it the invisible tax, resignations being made early, going to other professions, or staying in the profession and being bitter, being resentful. And I came across some data a couple of years ago that talked about the teacher dropout rate and how so many teachers, especially Black educators, are dropping out because they're tired of the hypocrisy and how the school systems are treating them. And so a lot of the work I do focuses especially on those teachers and educators in the school system and how they can make mental health and wellness a priority. But what did history have to say about that? How could we use history and the African-American experience to really inform how we instill self-care for ourselves, to inform how we do this anti-racist work and how we go about working as a community. And my eyes have really been open to see just so much work we still have to do in terms of working with our educators in the K-12 school system to really humanize the students, and then also have a deeper understanding of history and how history affects us today. So it's some difficult work that happens a lot of times, but it's important, necessary work, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is. And I think that part of being anti-racist, as you mentioned, right, is finding transformative ways of doing things, right? Things that we don't normally do, things that we don't normally connect. And I think so much of all of this is that we shy away from a lot of these things. And even just the way that you mentioned, bringing it into weddings and other occasions is that connection to generations and ancestry. And it's powerful. It's powerful, and it shifts that narrative for certain. And so, I mean, you've spoken about so many different things, and you're in this beautiful location that I would love to learn more about. You've mentioned a few times the museum, but tell us about what brought you to even the museum itself, from all this other work to now you are a curator in this museum. You're a historian who's taken this work. How did that begin? And just tell us about the space.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. So being in the school system of 12 years, I enjoyed working with the students, and I love being in the education system in terms of connecting with students, working with parents and families and whatnot. Taught African American Studies seminar. However, I wasn't in a position in the school system to focus exclusively on history in the way that I can now. I felt restricted in the school system, and the way things ended up, I left last school year, the school system that I was in, the Howard County Public School System, and I believe that when you take those bold risks, things will align and be revealed to you to let you know you'll get some confirmation and some affirmation that you might be making the right decision, or you might need to be a certain place. So the timeliness of the museum coming into my life was right there spot on in a moment where I was transitioning from the school system. And, this museum here, which was founded in 1987 by Wileen Sims Birch, who was the founder of the museum. She was an avid collector of African-American collectibles, artifacts, various materials, artwork. And the museum was in the process of undergoing a transformation in and of itself, because there was a massive flood that occurred on the second floor. The museum is about 2 stories. It looks like a house from the outside, modest sized building, not that large, but there was a flood resulting in water going everywhere in the facility. So the artifacts and the different things that were here as part of the museum's collection had to be evacuated and taken out. And so the things were taken out, renovations and fixtures had to take place. And so this happened in 2020. So here we are last year, 2022, and seeing what was happening. A good friend of mine brought me in and told me what was happening. He was a fellow historian himself. And being that I did a lot of research on local African-American history of Howard County, being that I was from Howard County, attended Howard County Public Schools, and still reside in Howard County, it seemed like a wonderful recipe of success to get involved. And as I got involved and saw what was going on, I was offered a position as a curator there or here. And so what my task was to play my part to spearhead the efforts and assemble a team to revamp and restore the institution. So when we talk about storytelling, curating and putting up pictures and artifacts and books and trinkets and collectibles and ephemera, there's something powerful about telling the story in that way as well too. So I feel like I'm still teaching. I give tours here. I'm able to see how the community and how the public respond and how they react to coming into this space. And so February 28th, the last day in February this year, we had our reopening. And we opened up for the community. We didn't know if we were going to even be able to open up or recover from the flood damage and being able to get things back up and assembled. And so I took what we had in those boxes and I assessed what we had in our collection, what was able to be preserved and salvaged, and established an exhibit development team, a small team, to actually put together 3 exhibit spaces. And so I'm in our largest gallery and our largest exhibit space as we speak now, talking to you. And it's just been so rewarding. This here is Geography of Resistance, Underground Railroad and Network to Freedom. Shout out to Dr. Cheryl LaRoche, who is a scholar, professor. She's at University of Maryland. And we have 2 other exhibits as well. The African Diaspora Experience is another exhibit. And we have another exhibit entitled Citizenship, Civil Rights, and the Struggle for Human Rights, where we go from emancipation on up to Reconstruction, Jim Crow, segregation, desegregation, on into living history trailblazers and pioneers of Howard County. And so it's been another skill set that I've acquired, learning on the fly as a curator. I've been able to also basically, like I said, this is my classroom. So I'm focusing on history central to the work I'm doing and not necessarily on the perimeter as much. People coming into the door are inquisitive about history because as much as stuff is being banned and as much as stuff is being cut off, and as many things that are not being taught in terms of history. On the flip side, people are coming into the door with a hunger and they want to know about history and they want to grapple with that. And the last thing I'll say is that the AHA, the American Historical Association, did a study a couple of years ago, and they basically was able to see, as a result of polling people from like 18 to 65, that the public now trusts museums more than any other space to provide an authentic, genuine history. And so with that data point, it just makes me even more up to the task to try to provide as rich of a living, breathable, authentic history through storytelling and artifacts and cultural enrichment as much as possible. So I feel like I'm here with the ancestors, those that have gone before me. I'm here in my element, you know, and there's moments that I sit here in this space, even as I'm talking to you, and I think and reflect like, man, you know, this is so powerful. Sometimes even myself, I'm like, man, like, am I really up in here? Like, I got Douglass in here. I got Mama Harriet Tubman behind me. I got abolitionists. I got anti-slave advocates. I got, you know, the African continent and diaspora speaking to me culturally. You know, I have all that rich history right here. And so I'm on a high every day. And so that is what I would say is paying the power, taking these narratives that I was taught earlier on from a deficit-based perspective, from a damaging based perspective, and transforming that into something empowering and triumphant, and something that is just inspiring, and sharing that with the public. And so, you know, I keep a little notebook of, you know, all the people who come in here and where they're from, and like, you know, what made them want to come into the museum. And the responses and the feedback from the community have been so powerful. So I know history heals in real time. People come in here and they'll break down and have tears of joy. They'll feel better being in the space. They feel like they're time traveling. They feel like they're right at home. They feel like there's a sense of peace here. These are anecdotes from those coming in here. So history can heal. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think it definitely does, right? History does heal, and it seems like you've brought so many people in there to experience that. First off, I'm so glad that everything was able to be salvaged from the flood, and that the flood did not create the damage of the artifacts, right? That's a huge thing. And you know, that's a beautiful way to have transitioned your story into being the curator of this space, and that story of your pain to power. I appreciate that. Like, one of the things that you talked about was the idea of the focus on the local history, which oftentimes I think we talk about history as though it's this theoretical idea beyond our current spaces, and to connect those current spaces is very powerful. I'm also from the DMV, right? I grew up in Maryland, and not in Howard County, but in Montgomery County. But I think, you know, I know we also have in Montgomery County the Sandy Springs Slave Museum, which is also about the history of Montgomery County. But every space carries and holds so many stories of resistance, of interrupters, of power, and we have to elevate and bring them to the surface so that others can see them. And you're definitely doing that through this space. But you also, so as we're talking about this, you know, thinking about your personal journey, you know, you're surrounded by stories. But when you think about yourself, for yourself, those moments where you are going through challenges, or you are, especially particularly in racism and experiencing racism in your life, what are some of those stories that ground you and keep you motivated to continue forward, to not stay in those painful spaces, but rather to continue with that healing?
That's a great question. Because we're human beings, so things can still affect us on various levels. And you know, I would say the stories, when I look and see what the likes of a Frederick Douglass went through, or you know, once again, as we talk, as there's more conversation about like Juneteenth and emancipation, looking at like seeing the hardships and seeing the obstacles historically that many African Americans had to endure or go through, I'm like, wow, look at what they persevered through. So if they could persevere through that, then that gives me inspiration. That gives me confidence to be able to do what I have to do to persevere and make it through what I may be going through. Writing has been very therapeutic for me. And, you know, we've talked about this, you know, before anyway. writing has been for me a way to channel my thoughts and my emotions and put it on the page to process and to be able to even become more clear-minded as to what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling. And sometimes after reading what I put down and processing that, I might even come up with some different conclusions than what I may have once had in my own brain and in my own mind. Meditation, those types of things. I a little while back came across information that suggested that Rosa Parks, we all know Rosa Parks is the one who refused to give up her seat. She was an activist in her own right and whatnot. But Rosa Parks did yoga. She did yoga to like connect with her like family and like her loved ones, and that balance, even and as I say this, I'm speaking about myself, but this is also what I'm saying to others who are doing passion work, the healers, the leaders, the teachers, the activists. Part of what has helped me, and I'm still working on it, so I'm not claiming to be an expert at it, but that balance piece, I have to be intentional about the self-care. I have to be intentional about making sure within this passion work and within this rewarding work that I also make time for family, that I also maybe exercise and go outside and, maybe not now because of the air quality and the pollen and all of that, but like jog and get nature, like be amongst nature and maintain good relationships and whatnot, and get rest, like to do this work long term, right? This is a marathon, not a sprint. These are the things that help me to deal with those things, whether it's racism or the challenges of working with difficult personalities or systemic inequalities or whatever the case may be. It almost becomes like by practicing these things, I almost think of it as developing my armor and my capacity to withstand it more because I have built myself up. I had a personal trainer a few years ago. Shout out to Lewis Robertson. He told me, like, when the body stretches on a regular basis, and when those muscles are accustomed to like being flexible, they're being stretched in the right way, then that can then protect it long term from injury. Or if a muscle is injured, it can bounce back and recover quicker. And so for me, being flexible as well too. I could be at this museum all day, 24/7, 365. But is that healthy? I'm a husband. I'm a father, and so being balanced. And I think that that's really important. And I think, once again, for some of our educators, for some of our teachers, our healers, our activists, our disruptors, and all that type of stuff, I think one of the things, and I've even noticed this even in the work I've done with professional development and trainings, it's hard to put ourselves sometimes first. Balance. We will give of ourselves for the community till we're depleted, till we have nothing in our cup, right? We're running around, not setting boundaries, healthy boundaries. And so once again, that is also, I would say, important too. Get the therapy if we need to. Make sure that we're not always running the trainings and the circles, but also sometimes we can sit in and not have to run it. Sometimes we can be receiving it too. So there's all of that.
No, and it's so important. And I was grateful to be able to be on the receiving end of some of the work when I attended your session, and being able to be at the Bond Academy. And there's so many different experiences like that where we do get to be the receivers. I love how you have been so masterful in connecting so many elements of who we are to history. I mean, there's the mental, right? And just the understanding and logic and intellectual, but there's the emotional. And you talked about just the physical too, right? And the carrying of that history, as well as spiritual. I love the new fact that Rosa Parks did yoga. Did not know that. But and in that way, you know, I think you and I have talked about this, right? As writers, and oftentimes history is not just an artifacts of physical, you know, items like images and statues and things, but also it's the writing, right? It's those primary source writing documents, and I'm curious to know if there have been any particular written documents that kind of like ignited some thinking in you, or opened up like an aha moment to something that you never knew or understood, or a new dynamic to someone in history that kind of changed your perspective on understanding things.
That's a great question. And so I think about oral history, right? So oral history is an opportunity to talk to perhaps those who might have lived or experienced certain things or are still living to tell their story, you know. And I'm very fortunate to be in this museum where I'm amongst elders all day. So I get their stories and I get what they lived through and all of that. I remember, and I have the artifact right here to share with you all. This right here is a old school attendance sheet from a segregated color school in 1912. From the Highland community in Howard County. And I was given this whenever I did an oral history interview when I was working on my master's thesis at Morgan State. As an educator, and being from Howard County, this really resonated with me because on this attendance sheet, it's one thing to know about the inequities in education, but to hear from somebody talk about the nuance and the complexity on this attendance sheet, Black students actually had to walk 2 miles, 3 miles, 3.5 miles, while other groups, white students, were getting bused to school. Some of these students didn't have shoes. When they would get home from walking to and fro to that one-room schoolhouse that was overcrowded with a couple of teachers and so many students, some of their feet hurt, and the mothers and the parents had to massage the feet of those children once they walked back home because there were no busing and they had to walk so far to get to school. The ages of these children in the same classroom, ages 11 and 10 and 6 and 13, the range of ages, because there was no high school at the time for no Black children to matriculate to. So, you know, we talk about systemic inequities, but these primary sources and engaging with these primary sources help give more texture and more complexity and more nuance to these stories from people who actually lived it, hearing stories about, you know, Black students getting those hand-me-down books, and they knew they was hand-me-down books because the white child's name was scribbled out, you know, when they received them, and just the countless stories when busing was finally provided, and just, you know, being told about how it was 2 hours to get to school one way with that one bus that was provided for those Black students because they had to go all around the county to get all of the students before they got to the school. So artifacts can take on many different forms, as we know. And so these documents have power, these oral stories and these oral narratives have power. And when we talk about the erasure of history, I think it's important for us to be clear. It's not just the war happening in the classroom with textbooks. Yes, that is a war as well, too. I think Carter G. Woodson said that, you know, the first lynching is in the classroom. But I would also suggest that erasure of history is also those voices and stories that are silenced. And one of the things to explain that point further is, like, one of the things that we're doing at our museum is having an oral history initiative where we're inviting Black families to come to the museum who have lived in Howard County for a long period of time to talk about their Black neighborhoods, their Black communities that are now being, you know, kind of being lost. Those stories are being lost by developers moving in. Those histories are being lost. And so that also has a lot to do, too, with the erasure, the institutions and the stories. And the thing about, you know, storytelling, as you know, Maria, you know, like, it's courageous to tell stories. It's not always easy to tell our story because, you know, like, it brings back once again, those feelings of discomfort, those sensitive areas. And so it's a process. And so, but these artifacts and documents could also help do the work to explain and give context to what it is that we're looking at in the past. So that is probably one of my most impactful documents, and one of the ones that has impacted me the most. Back from 1912, a segregated color school, I'm holding an actual attendance sheet that, has survived all this time. I think that's pretty cool.
I think that's beautiful. And I think, again, that erasure of history also, I think, has erased the humanity of those experiences. And what you elevated, I think, is, and it made me think about the idea of sometimes how we look at data, right? And those are numbers. Those are numbers in and of themselves. It could be just a conversation on numbers, on whom and how many people and where people came from, but not the stories behind them, not what did their parents have to do to support them. What was that experience to be a child and have to manage that, the physical pain, but also the emotional hardship of all of those experiences of knowing and recognizing and internalizing that I am getting the hand-me-down books of other children who are getting something different, right? Like there's so much to process, I think, that we miss when we don't even talk about history, but also in the way that we approach it is so important. And so thank you so much, Marcus. Everything that you shared in the ways that you're approaching history and healing through history, in the counter narratives, in elevating this on so many levels and so many places is so powerful. And I really appreciate that you shared your story, that you shared your work, that you shared your vision and how it's all been. Before we end today, I would love for you to just share where can people go to follow more about what you're doing, and tell us more about just how they can come to the museum, the location, everything. All this is also in the links below, but we just want to hear, how do we continue to follow you and learn more about history healing?
Sure thing. And I just want to say thank you so much for the conversation and for having me on, and looking forward to continue to build our relationship and continue to have more conversations. But from the History Heals Consulting side of things, you can go to my website to start, historyhealsconsulting.com, and see the services that I offer: wellness groups, speaking engagements, educational consulting, professional development, workshops and trainings, and many other different things. So you can go to the website. My email is info@historyhealsconsulting.com. And so you could always reach out to me that way. I'm on social media. I'm on Instagram at History Heals. I'm on Facebook, History Heals Consulting. And I'm on Twitter at History_Heals. And I'm on LinkedIn as well, too. And so you can reach out to me through that way. And then from a museum side of things, I'm here at the Howard County Center of African American Culture, located in the heart of Howard County in Columbia, Maryland. And the address here, for those who want to come for a tour, those who want to come and explore what we have, and those who want to stay connected with what we're doing, our address is 5434 Vantage Point Road, Columbia, Maryland, 21044. Our hours of operation are Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 12 noon to 4 o'clock p.m. If you come on through, yours truly, myself, is who you will see most likely greeting you with a smile, with a warm welcome, and I'd be honored and delighted to take you around and show you what we have in our gallery spaces and in our exhibit spaces. And we also have some others here who are delightful, who would also be more than happy to show you around and to engage with you and have some conversations in an intimate, nice, cozy, comfortable way about history. And that's one of the things people say about our space. It's not big in size, but it's rich and mighty in history. And it's in a space where it's between DC and Baltimore, and you can get some local history of Howard County and beyond here as well. And so our website, hccaac.org, is our website there. And if you want to reach out to me from a curatorial standpoint, my email is curator CURATOR@hccaac.org. So that probably was a lot, but I know what you said, Mara. You'll put the links and everything out
All
there.
the links will be below, so you'll find all the information. But thank you so much, Marcus. I am looking forward to, especially with summer coming, people are going on field trips. You're taking your children places. You're going and exploring the area. If you're in the DMV, please go and experience this. I look forward to bringing my children and coming and getting that tour and learning more about the stories behind all of the history of particularly Howard County and the area that we live in. So thank you so much again, Marcus. I really appreciate your time today. And thank you to all of you who have joined us. This show was brought to you in association with the iRant Network. And thank you to of course, my amazing producer, Dialogic, all of our Ranters Network family who has shown up in the chat and in the and are watching. Please make sure to tune in every Sunday at 9 o'clock for more episodes of Pain to Power. And as you continue to go through your days to find your healing, find those stories, hear those stories, listen and connect to the stories of the generations. And remember, as Marcus Sankofa-Nix has said to us, we must always move forward while always still looking back and recognizing that our history is part of who we are and part of our story and journey of pain to power. So please continue to find your power in your pain, heal with community, stay with us, and join me every week at 9 o'clock on Sundays on Brown Girl Interrupting on YouTube, on the iRant Network on YouTube, and on the Ranters Union on YouTube. Thank you again, Marcus, for a beautiful conversation. I appreciate everything you lifted up, and I look forward to staying in connection. And thank you to our audience. Have a beautiful evening. Peace, love, and light.
Peace.